On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington loaded 2,400 freezing, starving soldiers into flat-bottomed wooden boats and pushed them out into the icy Delaware River. A brutal blizzard of sleet, snow, and rain was howling across the water. Jagged chunks of floating ice slammed against the hulls of the wooden boats, threatening to crush them at any second. Most of Washington's men had no boots. Their feet were wrapped in filthy rags, leaving trails of fresh blood in the white snow. On the other side of that freezing river sat the town of Trenton, New Jersey. Inside, over 1,000 elite German mercenaries, known as Hessians, were warm, rested, and sleeping off their holiday celebrations. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were cold-blooded, highly trained professional killers hired by the British Crown. They had never lost a battle to the Americans, and they were convinced the war was already over. They had no idea what was coming for them in the dark. Within 90 minutes of Washington's attack the next morning, the battle was completely over. More than 900 elite Hessian soldiers were captured, dozens were killed, and the American army suffered 0 combat deaths. It was one of the most unbelievable, lopsided victories in the entire history of warfare. But this was not just a lucky strike by a desperate general rolling the dice. This was the single most dangerous gamble in American history. A midnight strike so insane, so aggressive, and so completely unexpected that it shocked the entire British Empire to its core. If Washington failed that night, his entire army would have been wiped out. The leaders of the rebellion would have been hanged for treason, and the dream of American independence would have died right there on the frozen banks of the Delaware River before the nation was even born. So how did a ragtag group of barefoot farmers and shopkeepers manage to pull off the ultimate tactical surprise against the most feared professional fighting force on the planet? To understand how George Washington found himself standing on a freezing riverbank on Christmas night with everything on the line, you have to look at the total disaster that happened just 4 months earlier. If you had asked anyone in London or New York about the American Revolution in the autumn of 1776, they would have told you the rebellion was already dead. And if you looked at the numbers, they were completely right. Just 4 months before Trenton, in August of 1776, George Washington suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Long Island. The British commander, General William Howe, completely outflanked Washington's raw troops, trapping the American army against the East River. It was the largest battle of the entire war, and it turned into an absolute slaughter. Washington barely escaped under the cover of a thick morning fog, secretly rowing 9,000 men across the river to Manhattan. That escape saved the army from total destruction, but it did not stop the bleeding. What followed was 4 long months of embarrassing, humiliating retreats. The British Army chased Washington out of Manhattan. They chased him across the Hudson River. They chased him through the muddy roads of New Jersey. Every time the Americans tried to make a stand, the professional British redcoats and their German mercenaries smashed through their lines with fixed bayonets. Washington lost Fort Washington, losing nearly 3,000 soldiers as prisoners, along with massive stockpiles of cannons, gunpowder, and tents. By December, Washington's army had shrunk from over 20,000 men to a broken, shivering remnant of barely 3,000 soldiers. Imagine what it was like inside that camp. The men were starving. Their uniforms had rotted into thin rags. Hundreds of soldiers were forced to walk through frozen mud with no shoes, leaving bloody footprints everywhere they marched. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia were ripping through the ranks, killing men in their sleep every single night. To make matters worse, the Continental Congress had panicked and fled Philadelphia, abandoning Washington to his fate. The paper money issued by Congress was so worthless that local farmers refused to sell food to the starving American soldiers, choosing instead to sell their crops to the British for solid gold and silver. And then came the ticking clock that threatened to destroy everything. Back in 1776, American soldiers did not sign up for years at a time. They signed short enlistment contracts, often for just 6 or 9 months. On December 31st, 1776, the enlistments for almost every single soldier in Washington's camp were set to expire. In less than 2 weeks, these men had the legal right to throw down their muskets, turn around, and walk home. Washington knew that if December 31st arrived without a victory, his army would simply vanish overnight. The writer Thomas Paine was traveling with Washington's retreating army, writing words by the light of campfires on the drums of fallen soldiers. He published a pamphlet that opened with a line every American knew: "These are the times that try men's souls." Over in New York City, British General William Howe was so convinced the rebellion was finished that he ordered his troops to stop chasing Washington. Howe packed up his bags, handed command over to his subordinates, and prepared to sail back to England for the winter social season. He set up a chain of small outposts across New Jersey to hold the ground, believing the cold weather and starvation would finish off the rebels without firing another shot. The largest and most exposed of these outposts sat right on the Delaware River in a small town called Trenton. The men holding the town of Trenton were not British regulars. They were 1,500 German mercenaries from the region of Hesse-Kassel, known to the world as the Hessians. In the 18th century, German princes regularly rented out their highly trained armies to foreign nations for massive cash payments. These Hessians were not fighting for a cause, for freedom, or for a king. They were professional killers who had been drilling in military tactics since they were young boys. They were famous across Europe for their ruthless discipline, their terrifying bayonet charges, and their refusal to show mercy on the battlefield. To the average American colonist, the Hessians were nightmare figures. Rumors spread through the colonies that these German soldiers slaughtered surrendering men, looted civilian homes, and showed zero pity to anyone who opposed them. Commanding the Hessian garrison at Trenton was Colonel Johann Röhl. Röhl was a 50-year-old combat veteran with decades of military experience under his belt. He was brave in battle, aggressive, and fiercely proud of his men. At the Battle of Long Island and White Plains earlier that year, Röhl's Hessians had smashed through American lines with brutal ease, routing the rebels every single time they faced them. And that easy success created a fatal flaw in Colonel Röhl: absolute, blinding arrogance. Röhl held a deep personal contempt for the American soldiers. He openly called them country clowns and a ragtag mob of farmers. He refused to believe that these starving, barefoot rebels possessed the courage or the discipline to attack a professional German garrison. When Röhl's own engineers pointed out that the town of Trenton had no defensive walls, no earthen redoubts, and no barricades, they urged him to build fortifications immediately. Röhl laughed off their warnings. He waved his hand dismissively and famously declared, "Let them come. We want no trenches. We will go at them with the bayonet." His officers grew increasingly nervous as Christmas approached. Local loyalists reported that Washington's army was gathering boats on the opposite side of the Delaware River. Small groups of American partisans were constantly raiding Hessian outposts, firing shots at night and slipping away into the woods. Röhl ignored it all, treating the raids as minor annoyances rather than the warning signs of a coming storm. On the evening of December 25th, as a freezing snowstorm began to lash the town of Trenton, Röhl sat inside his comfortable headquarters, drinking wine, singing holiday songs, and playing cards with his senior officers. Later that night, a local loyalist farmer tapped urgently on the door. He carried a handwritten note containing vital intelligence. Washington's army was actively crossing the icy Delaware River at that very moment and marching straight toward Trenton. The guards handed the note to Colonel Roll during his card game. Roll, annoyed by the interruption, shoved the unread slip of paper directly into his coat pocket without even unfolding it, and returned to his game and his wine. That single unread note would cost Colonel Johann Roll his life, his army, and the entire British grip on the American colonies. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains the exact moment where arrogance turned into one of the greatest traps in military history. While Roll slept off his holiday celebrations, 2,400 men were fighting for their lives in the middle of a frozen river. At 6 p.m. on Christmas evening, 1776, George Washington gave the order to assemble. The sun went down, the temperature plummeted below freezing, and a brutal northeast winter storm slammed into the Delaware River Valley. What Washington was attempting to pull off was logistically insane. To cross that river, he relied on a special unit of Massachusetts mariners led by Colonel John Glover, rugged fishermen, sailors, and dock workers from Marblehead. These men managed a fleet of massive 60-foot black wooden Durham boats, normally used to haul heavy iron ore down the river. The conditions on the water were apocalyptic. A howling mix of sleet, snow, and freezing rain blinded the rowers. Jagged ice floes, driven by a violently churning tide, crashed against the wooden sides of the boats with bone-rattling force. Heavy iron cannons, weighing thousands of pounds, had to be carefully balanced on slippery wooden ferries, along with hundreds of terrified, thrashing horses. One wrong step or sudden shift in weight meant instant death in the black, freezing water. Washington had originally planned for 3 separate forces to cross at different points along the river, converging on Trenton in a massive 3-pronged surprise attack. But the storm was so violently destructive that the other 2 commanders gave up, declaring the crossing completely impossible. They assumed Washington would do the same. They did not understand George Washington. Washington stood on the muddy, icy bank, wrapped in his dark cloak, watching the clock tick away. The operation was falling dangerously behind schedule. The plan required the entire army to cross, assemble, and march 9 miles south to hit Trenton under the cover of total pre-dawn darkness at 5 a.m. But hauling 18 heavy field cannons across the ice-choked river took hours longer than expected. The last soldier did not step off the ferry onto the New Jersey side until 3 a.m. Washington was trapped in an impossible dilemma. If he ordered a retreat back across the river, his exhausted troops would be caught in broad daylight on open water and slaughtered by British reinforcements. But if he pushed forward, his men would attack Trenton after sunrise, losing the critical element of total surprise. Washington looked at his officers, squared his shoulders, and made his choice. He declared, "For my own part, I have crossed the river. I have determined to push on or die." At 4 a.m., the march to Trenton began. It was a 9-mile forced march through pitch darkness, driving sleet, and blinding snow over frozen, rutted roads. Hundreds of soldiers had no boots at all. They wrapped their bleeding feet in filthy rags and burlap sacks, leaving a bright red trail in the fresh snow behind them. Men kept their muskets tucked deep inside their coats, trying desperately to keep their gunpowder dry from the freezing rain. The cold was so punishing that 2 soldiers collapsed on the icy road, froze to death, and were left buried in the drifts. Future President James Monroe, then an 18-year-old lieutenant, marched near the front of the column, watching men stumble and stagger forward through sheer force of will. By 7 a.m., as the grey winter morning finally broke through the clouds, Washington's column reached a fork in the road 2 miles outside Trenton. Washington split his shivering force into two tactical columns to encircle the town. General Nathanael Greene led one column from the north, while General John Sullivan swung wide to strike from the west along the river. It was 8 a.m. The pre-dawn darkness was long gone. The element of night surprise was officially dead. And this is where the trap closed. At 8 a.m. on December 26, 1776, a Hessian sentry standing at an outpost on the northern edge of Trenton looked out into the driving snowstorm. Through the white haze, he saw hundreds of dark figures emerging from the tree line. Before he could process what he was seeing, rifle shots cracked through the freezing air. The sentry screamed, "Der Feind!" the enemy, and fired his musket into the storm as American skirmishers charged forward. Within seconds, the battle erupted on two sides of the town simultaneously. Just as Nathanael Greene's column hit the northern edge of Trenton, John Sullivan's column thundered in from the west along the river road, completely cutting off the primary Hessian line of retreat toward Princeton. Washington's double envelopment was executing with absolute, terrifying precision. Inside Trenton, drums beat violently, screaming alarms through the narrow streets. Hessian soldiers, still half asleep and dazed from holiday celebrations, tumbled out of their quarters in chaotic confusion, trying desperately to strap on their heavy leather boots, pull on their uniforms, and form their ranks in the biting cold. Colonel Johann Rall burst out of his headquarters on King Street, hungover and frantic. He mounted his horse, shouting orders to form up, but the streets were already a slaughterhouse. American artillery, organized by Colonel Henry Knox, had taken position at the top of King and Queen Streets, the two main roads running straight through the center of Trenton. Knox loaded his heavy cannons with canister shot, canvas bags packed with hundreds of solid iron balls. When fired, canister shot acted like giant, military-grade shotguns. Knox's gunners unleashed hell down the narrow streets. The iron balls tore through the Hessian ranks, smashing wooden buildings, shattering muskets, and cutting down dozens of German soldiers before they could even form a proper firing line. Hessian officers tried desperately to set up two brass field cannons in the middle of King Street to break the American barrage. But before they could fire, American Captain William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, and Lieutenant James Monroe led a daring, suicidal bayonet charge straight down the street, capturing both German cannons before they could unleash a single shot. Monroe was hit in the shoulder by a musket ball, severing an artery, and barely survived thanks to a field doctor who plugged the bleeding right on the snow. Meanwhile, a massive logistical crisis threatened to ruin the American advance. The relentless freezing rain and sleet had soaked the gunpowder inside hundreds of American muskets. Officers rushed up to General John Sullivan, reporting in panic that their weapons were completely soaked and could not fire. Sullivan turned to an aide, sent a message to Washington, and asked what to do. Washington's reply was cold, direct, and legendary. "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take the town." American soldiers fixed their bayonets and charged directly into the buildings, driving Hessian troops from house to house in savage, close-quarters, hand-to-hand combat. Colonel Rall managed to gather about 500 of his men in an apple orchard on the eastern edge of town. He ordered a desperate counterattack, drawing his sword and leading a bayonet charge back toward the town center, while his regimental band played military marches in the snow. It was useless. American riflemen, crouched behind stone walls, fences, and second-story windows, poured a devastating crossfire into the exposed Hessian formation. Two musket balls struck Colonel Rall directly in the side. He slumped in his saddle, bleeding heavily, and fell off his horse into the red snow. Seeing their commander fall, the remaining Hessian soldiers threw down their muskets, raised their hands and begged for mercy. The entire battle had lasted roughly 90 minutes. The numbers were staggering. Out of 1,500 Hessians, 22 were killed, 86 were wounded, and 918 were taken prisoner. The Americans captured all 1,000 muskets, 6 artillery pieces, 6 brass drums, and massive stores of food, shoes, and gunpowder. American losses? Just 2 men frozen to death on the march, and only 5 wounded in combat. 0 American soldiers died on the battlefield. Colonel Rawl was carried to a local home, where George Washington personally visited his dying enemy, accepting his surrender with quiet dignity before Rawl succumbed to his wounds later that evening. Inside Rawl's coat pocket, officers found the note handed to him during his card game the night before, still folded, unread, and soaked in blood. When news of the disaster at Trenton reached London, it struck the British government like a lightning bolt. Lord George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, sat stunned in Parliament. The British public had been promised that the rebellion was dead, that the rebels were fleeing, and that the war was virtually over. Instead, an army of professional German veterans had been completely wiped off the map in under 2 hours by a ragtag mob of farmers. Germain later wrote in bitter shock to Parliament, "All our hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton." The psychological impact of Trenton across the American colonies was immediate, explosive, and profound. Overnight, the narrative of the war completely flipped. The belief that British regulars and Hessian mercenaries were invincible was shattered forever. Citizens who had given up on the revolution suddenly found their faith restored. When December 31st arrived, just 5 days later, George Washington stood before his shivering soldiers on the parade ground. He offered them a $10 bounty, a massive sum for the time, and appealed directly to their patriotism. Inspired by the miracle at Trenton, over half of those barefoot, exhausted men whose enlistments were expiring stepped forward and agreed to re-enlist. The Continental Army survived to fight another day. Just 1 week after Trenton, Washington proved that his victory was no fluke. When British General Charles Cornwallis marched south with 5,000 elite troops to trap Washington at Trenton, Cornwallis boasted to his officers that he would bag the old fox in the morning. Instead, Washington pulled off another masterclass in deception. He left his campfires burning bright, ordered a small detail to bang shovels against the frozen ground all night to mimic trench digging, and secretly marched his main army around Cornwallis's flank in the pitch darkness. By dawn, Cornwallis struck an empty camp, while Washington was 12 miles north, smashing the British garrison at the Battle of Princeton. The 10 days from Christmas 1776 to January 3, 1777, completely rescued the American Revolution from total extinction. Military historians still study the Battle of Trenton as one of the most perfectly executed tactical surprises in human history. It proved that a leader who truly understands his men, who embraces bold deception, and who is willing to gamble everything when the odds are absolute zero, can rewrite the fate of nations. Without that midnight crossing through the freezing ice of the Delaware River, there would be no Declaration of Independence realized, no United States of America, and no modern free world as we know it today. It was the single midnight gamble that saved a revolution. If this deep tactical breakdown opened your eyes to the real history behind the birth of a nation, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We break down the greatest military strategies, forgotten battles, and history's wildest turning points every single week. And you will not want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell us,